Hello and welcome to Great Western, and in this edition we have an air accident special. We're going to discuss Flight 901's collision with Mount Erebus in the Antarctic in 1979. I'm aiming this video at the non-casual viewer who has some interest in the crash. And apart from my own conclusions, I also hope to point you towards wider reading so you can aid your own understanding of this accident. As I hope to demonstrate in the conclusions, the key to this disaster is revealed in the final few minutes of the cockpit voice recorder transcript, something that was overlooked by the Royal Commission but was not overlooked by the air accident investigator Ron Chippendale. So, let's actually have a look at the accident itself. It took place on the 29th of November 1979. It involved a DC-10 code ZKNZP, and the photograph on these two slides that I've been showing is the actual aircraft at Heathrow, I believe, in 1979, where it looks very shiny and new. There were 237 passengers on board, but the flight was not full. Why? This was a sightseeing flight to the Antarctic. There were also 20 crew on board, bringing the total of deaths to 257. Everybody on board the DC-10 was killed in the blink of an eye as the plane flew into the lower slopes of the volcano Mount Erebus in the Antarctic. This was a huge tragedy for New Zealand, a country at the time of approximately 4 million people, and it has been said that everybody knew somebody connected with the disaster. It perhaps didn't help that Air New Zealand was a government-owned company, and the reputation of that company was at stake as the crash was investigated. What was baffling about this terrible accident was that looking at developed passenger photos from the final minutes of the flight revealed that the aircraft was flying in clear air. There was no question of recklessness or flying through bad weather, and this meant that the crash was hard to understand. It also turned out that the aircraft, the DC-10, was in perfect working order. But it has to be said, the ultimate outcome of the flight and the cockpit voice recorder evidence indicate that there was something wrong, although it wasn't immediately apparent to the crew. And thankfully, the passengers were completely oblivious to any problem whatsoever. As I've already said, the crash was a grim sensation throughout New Zealand, and of course, as with any air accident, there had to be a formal investigation. This was undertaken by the head of Air Accident Investigations in New Zealand, the former Royal New Zealand Air Force Squadron Leader Ron Chippendale. Over the years, through the various books and television programmes about this incident, Ron Chippendale has been cast as a man who was out of his depth, and that the most important crashes that he'd ever dealt with up to this time were light aircraft crashes, which apparently happened with depressing frequency in New Zealand. But as I have said, he was a squadron leader with the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and he was of course a pilot himself. So it doesn't necessarily follow that he was completely out of his depth with big jets. Ron Chippendale actually flew to the Antarctic to see the wreckage for himself, and there was a huge police operation to identify the bodies at the same time. And recently a documentary was made about that. Ron Chippendale's verdicts were as follows. The aircraft crashed because it was heading towards an area of poor surface and horizon definition. He didn't say that the plane was flying through cloud, and he knew the passengers' photographs would not support that conclusion. He also suggested that the crew, the captain and the co-pilot, Captain Jim Collins and Flight Officer Gregory Cassin, were not entirely sure of their position when they descended to a very low level of 1,500 feet through a gap in the cloud base. He was also at pains to point out that the MSA, the minimum safe altitudes for these flights, were 16,000 feet until reaching McMurdo Sound, and the reason for this was to overfly Mount Erebus, which stood at some 13,500 feet and was easily the highest ground in the area. The volcano, covered in snow, occupying Ross Island, which is at the mouth of McMurdo Sound. There was also another minimum safe altitude for the McMurdo area of 6,000 feet. And so Ron Chippendale's argument was that both of these altitudes had been breached, and this was one of the causes of the crash. Even before Ron Chippendale had fully and formally revealed his air accident report to the general public, there was pressure from the families of victims, and especially from the families of the flight crew, that there be another investigation into the crash. The reasons for this were it was becoming apparent from draft copies of the report that Ron Chippendale was going to blame the pilots. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably have some interest in air crash investigation, and you may well be aware that blaming the pilots is the oldest trick in the book. Usually they are dead and they are not there to answer themselves, and this often gives the families an added incentive to try and clear their names. So there was a lot of unhappiness that the pilots were going to be blamed for the entirety of the crash. And so Justice Peter Mulgrew was asked to form a royal commission to investigate the causes of the accident. It caused a sensation throughout New Zealand. Public hearings of all the major players involved were undertaken, and Justice Peter Mulgrew said that a litany of lies had been presented to him by the company in charge of the Antarctic flights, which, as I've already said, was the government-owned Air New Zealand. He put an enormous amount of blame upon the corporate structure of the airline and the incompetence of the navigation department. And he made clear something that Ron Chippendale had hinted at, and that was this shocking revelation. Every pilot or crew that went to the Antarctic had had a briefing, even though some of them had never flown there before. But they had had a briefing, and a route to McMurdo Station was shown, and the pilots naturally thought that this was the route that would be put into their INS navigation systems. INS means inertial navigation systems, which was the best type of navigation system at that time in the late 70s. And the DC-10's INS had proved to be very reliable and usually took aircraft to within a mile of the coordinates that had been pre-programmed into it. Incredibly, Justice Mahon made clear that the navigation department at Air New Zealand had changed the vital final coordinate the night before Flight 901 left Auckland. The trouble was, they didn't tell the flight crew. And Justice Peter Mulgrew said that this was the direct cause of the accident. The pilots had a right to believe the data that they had put into the INS. The INS had been programmed with the wrong data and it had flown them straight into the volcano. Although controversial and causing a sensation, Justice Mahon was thorough. Almost a year to the day of the crash, he was in a helicopter flying towards Mount Erebus. He wanted to experience the exact circumstances that the flight crew had seen as far as he possibly could. And the second big revelation or clarification, following on from Ron Chippendale, was that as he approached Mount Erebus in the helicopter, he experienced whiteout. Whiteout is an optical phenomena that takes place in the Antarctic. If you have clouds above your aircraft, even quite high above them, and a snow-covered surface, and if you have, as this crew did, the sun directly behind them, an optical illusion is created. And probably the most famous photographs of that optical illusion appear in Justice Mahn's report. where the helicopter he was travelling in towards the volcano sees the volcano disappear and an apparently flat white horizon appear. Justice Mahon was absolutely convinced that this is the final thing that the crew of Flight 901 saw, and it lulled them into a false sense of security that they were indeed proceeding down McMurdo Sound, which was flat ice, towards McMurdo Base, exactly the position where they expected the INS to take them. I have said that Justice Mahon was thorough, and he was. He also investigated the air traffic control system at McMurdo Station, which was American owned. There were legal complications involved, as I'm sure you can imagine, but he did his best to find out what they knew. Initially, they were quite helpful, but when he actually visited the air traffic control as part of his Antarctic visit, they had become unhelpful. Justice Mahon had found out that 4 minutes of vital tape from air traffic control during the time that the flight had crashed had been accidentally wiped. Whether this was a genuine mistake or part of some sort of cover-up is difficult to say. But in defence of the Americans, we have the cockpit voice recording of the final 30 minutes of Flight 901. And I would suggest that any important information that air traffic control did or said during that time would probably have appeared on the cockpit voice recorder one way or the other. So it may not be that they were covering up a mistake or misleading information. On the other hand, it could be that they were covering up the fact that perhaps they took their eye off the ball for too long and they had kind of forgotten about Flight 901 and the few communications that they'd had with it before raising the alarm. Although it caused a sensation, the Royal Commission's verdict of completely exonerating the pilots has, over time, become less sensational and more grounded in facts. A highly skilled technical advisor to the judge was Air Marshal Sir Rochford Hughes, and he said that Justice Mahon wrote his report entirely on his own without referring to the Air Marshal for any sort of advice. And he came to the conclusion that Justice Mahon had been too lenient on the pilots. Why was that? Well, there were some other factors involved. Air New Zealand were very unhappy about the conclusion of the Royal Commission, and they went to the Court of Appeal and the Privy Council. And Justice Mahon's verdict of the litany of lies was formally and legally overturned. This means that Air New Zealand were culpable of committing a mistake, but not necessarily a cover-up. So, is Justice Mahon's report of any use at all? Air New Zealand were cleared of a deliberate corporate cover-up, so instead we have to presume that they were completely incompetent and had a poor organisational culture, which led to the wrong coordinates or changed coordinates being given to the pilots without telling them. So is Justice Mahon's commission completely null and void? Probably not. He did a lot of investigation, he found out a lot of new information, he experienced whiteout for himself, he saw the dangers that the crew of 901 faced, and he went about his report in a very thorough way. Yes, he did completely clear the pilots of blame, and as we shall see, this is not necessarily a solid conclusion, but that conclusion was not overturned by the Court of Appeal. So now we turn to the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, transcripts. The last 30 minutes of cockpit conversation was recorded on Flight 901 in accordance with standard international airline practice since the early 1970s. The voices of the pilots are relatively clear, but because of the poor quality and positioning of the cockpit microphone, other voices have proved to be harder to decipher. And because this was pre-9/11 and it was a sightseeing flight, there were also a lot of visitors to the cockpit. so there were snatches of irrelevant conversation and yet more different voices added into the mix. But it is generally accepted that the CVR transcript shows that Captain Jim Collins was typically conducting a very professional flight. But it also has areas of ambiguity, and it is interesting that some clear and verified statements from people in the cockpit were pretty much ignored by Justice Mahon. The crew, which was Jim Collins, Gregory Cassin, and 2 flight engineers, one of whom was Gordon Brooks, who had already been to Antarctica on a previous flight, were joined by Peter Mulgrew. Peter Mulgrew was a kind of heroic New Zealand explorer, and he had been to Antarctica many times. Justice Mahon reckoned that the crew knew where they were and were entitled to know where they were because of the data that they had put into their INS. But if you look at the cockpit transcript, Peter Mulgrew, Antarctic expert, says this: "Looks like the edge of Ross Island there." Peter Mulgrew was not the pilot in charge of the flight, obviously, but he was an Antarctic expert. And that statement that I've just quoted was one of several statements where he did not appear to be entirely sure where he was. And it's fair to say that there are other statements that imply that several people in the flight crew were not completely happy about the progress of the flight or the position of the flight. Probably the most chilling quotation comes from flight engineer Gordon Brooks, who 25 seconds before impact says, "I don't like this." This is the flight engineer who had previously made a comment about the position of Mount Erebus, asking the pilots where exactly was this 3,500 foot volcano in relation to the plane. And he was told that it was some 20 miles off to the left, because that is what they would have expected from their flight plan briefing and the information they'd put into the INS. Justice Mahon says that the crew were entitled to know exactly where they were and did know exactly where they were. But it's my contention that there was not enough attention paid to that vital aspect of airmanship, which is the Mark I human eyeball, particularly when flying at 1,500 feet in Antarctica, a place that neither the captain nor the first officer had ever flown in before. A very interesting book written by Captain Gordon Vette in his book Impact Erebus explains how modern cockpits work, and that is there is a flow of conversation between the participants, and the participants of interest here are the 2 pilots and the 2 flight engineers on board the cockpit of 901. Vette describes a feedback loop of dialogue in the cockpit, with each member allowed to confirm or question the strategy that is being proposed. The questioning is called a demure or demuring, and Brooks's final comment of "I don't like this" is a very strong demure, and perhaps the build-up of several demures that he has raised throughout the final minutes of the flight. Brooks is saying, "I am not happy with how the flight is now proceeding." In fairness, his meticulous colleague and the captain of the flight, Jim Collins, agrees. One of Jim Collins's final statements is this: "Actually, these conditions don't look very good at all. We will have to climb out of this." Here, I believe, is the captain responding positively to Brooks's strong demure. Tragically, it was too late. After a brief discussion about which direction to turn in, the GWS, which is the Ground Proximity Warning System, goes off, announcing that the aircraft is 500 feet above the ground. Then 400, 200, and impact. There was simply no time left to respond. What was the significance of these final words between Brooks and Collins? Well, I believe it is this. Brooks was the only member of crew on the flight deck who had flown to the Antarctic before. And I believe that he was spooked by what he saw out of the front of the cockpit. He didn't know it, but he was looking at the whiteout phenomena. And although the aircraft appeared to be in clear air, as evidenced by the passenger photographs. Ahead, where no photographs exist, perhaps things were looking strange and unnerving, and that instinct was proved to be entirely correct. I think Brooks's sixth sense was at work, and he knew that what he saw from the front of the cockpit did not correspond to things that he had seen on his previous Antarctic flight. Add to that, with his gentle questioning about positioning, high ground, and Mount Erebus, and I think that Gordon Brooks had an idea that the flight might be in trouble. Captain Collins, for his part, was known as a meticulous, responsible and respected captain in Air New Zealand, and he takes Brooks's demure seriously, and he also adds to it other factors that he and the first officer had noticed. First of all, although they were apparently flying straight and level over a flat surface, which they thought to be McMurdo Sound, there was no sign ahead of McMurdo Base, buildings, vehicles, people, which would be visible 20 miles in the distance, and should have been visible. Secondly, they were having trouble with their VHF radio, and they had not spoken to McMurdo Control on VHF at all. VHF works on line of sight, so if there is something in the way, such as a mountain, it isn't going to work. They had only raised McMurdo on HF, high frequency radio. The third thing that was probably playing on the captain's mind was that they hadn't been picked up by the McMurdo radar, which was going to be part of their final approach towards the base. These three factors, and perhaps the slightly strange view in front of the aircraft, led the captain to agree that the conditions didn't look good and it was time to climb out. This is pure speculation on my part, but is it possible that in these final tragic seconds Captain Collins began to suspect that he was not actually where he thought he was? Justice Mahon would not agree with that view. He said that Collins and Cassin had positively identified their location and they had made a tragic mistake. And the reason for that is the entrance to McMurdo Sound looks very similar to the entrance to the bay in Ross Island in front of the volcano. And that, of course, is a tragic coincidence and set of circumstances. But it is my contention that perhaps all that information and his flight engineer's concern led Captain Collins to perhaps begin to think seriously that he may not be where he thought he was. And possibly, though it will never be known, he was becoming aware that there could be a danger of high ground. Justice Mahon believes that when the ground proximity warning system went off, that none of the crew could believe or take it completely seriously, and they must have thought that it was a fault. Nonetheless, being a good pilot and captain, Captain Collins could not ignore it, and he chose to take evasive action. For what it is worth, I would like to share a few brief conclusions with you as we come towards the end of this video. First of all, Justice Mahon put all of the blame onto Air New Zealand for the disaster, and to change the flight plan the night before and not to tell the crew was, in my view, dangerously irresponsible and grossly incompetent. And I don't think many people would disagree with that. The only defence that they had was, had the pilots stuck very strictly and rigidly to the minimum safe altitudes, they would have flown over the volcano. But the Royal Commission discovered that there were many, many, many examples of where those minimum safe altitudes were seen as guidance. And let's not forget that flying high on a sightseeing flight isn't good for the tourists or the photographs, and that was a very strong factor in why people flew low. On the morning of the flight crew were given the coordinates for the track to McMurdo Sound, and it was their responsibility to enter them into the INS. I do have a question here. Jim Collins, it is very strongly thought, had plotted these waypoints onto an atlas, which he took with him in the cockpit. I do ask the question, why did the crew not check the coordinates that they were entering in against the coordinates of the flight plan that they were expecting? Because had they done so, they would have noticed that the final waypoint had been changed. I don't know the ins and outs of the system, and I don't know if it was possible, but I do put that up as one possible point against the pilots. Although you wouldn't expect there to be a mistake, was it possible for them to manually check the coordinates as they entered them into the INS? The second point I would like to make is that the cockpit voice recorder does seem to indicate that the crew were not 100% satisfied of their position, and neither was their Antarctic tour guide, Peter Mulgrew. Nobody at any point says absolutely positively that they can see something out of the window that they can definitively recognise as being exactly what they expect to see. Peter Mulgrew was not flying the plane, so he cannot share any blame for that, but it's interesting that this man who had visited Antarctica and been on previous sightseeing flights as a guide did not ever at any point say that he was certain where he was. And so the decision to go down to 1,500 feet under those circumstances seems very dubious indeed to me. Mahan's Royal Commission glossed over another point, that if low-level flying below the minimum safe altitudes was permitted, and it was essentially, you had to do so having been let down by radar from McMurdo Air Traffic Control. Captain Jim Collins didn't do this. He saw a gap in the clouds and flew down under what is called visual flight rules. The air traffic controller said that it was okay, but they probably shouldn't have said that because the DC-10 was not on radar. And the reason it wasn't on radar is that it was actually hidden behind Mount Erebus. Fourth conclusion is that tragically the weather was against them. As they approached McMurdo Sound, they realised that there was a cloud base of 10,000 feet, which was going to cause some difficulty with the sightseeing aspect of the flight. That is why Captain Collins flew down to 1,500 feet. But the weather was against them in lots of ways. As I've said earlier, the sun was directly behind them, and they were flying under this cloud base towards a gigantic snow-covered mountain, producing the whiteout optical phenomena, which effectively made the mountain invisible. If the weather had been better, this accident would surely have never happened. If there was no cloud base above them reflecting the light, the whiteout would not have happened, and the volcano would have been immediately visible, and the wrong position would have become readily apparent, and evasive action could have been taken. So, as I have been discussing, Justice Mahon takes a very selective pick of information from the cockpit voice recorder, and he spends almost no time discussing Flight Engineer Brooks's concerns. Although he was probably too low and in breach of the rules, Captain Collins did respond appropriately to the evidence that he had in front of him, but sadly it was too late. There was probably just a few seconds to get out of this disastrous situation, but those seconds were lost, ironically, by doing something responsible, which was discussing with the first officer which direction to turn in to get into a safer position. They were not at emergency readiness at this point. They were just trying to get themselves into a position where the radios were going to work properly and they would have radar contact. Immediately after that, the ground proximity warning system went off, and it was too late. This accident has been extensively written about, and I believe that I have read every serious and in-depth account of it. If you want a nice overview, the 1980s book Air Disasters by Stanley Stewart produces a fairly brief account of the accident. Going into much deeper depth, and from a position of not blaming the pilots, Air New Zealand pilot Gordon Vette wrote Impact Erebus, which explains in a lot of technical detail his view of what happened. It essentially accords with Justice Peter Mahon's view as stated by the Royal Commission. Peter Mahon, before his death in the mid-80s, wrote Erebus the Verdict, which I also found really helpful and easier to read than the actual report of the Royal Commission. But that's also freely available as well, although I haven't listed it here. Another really good account of this accident comes from MacArthur Job. the Australian aviation author, and in the paperback version, not the online version, but the paperback version of Air Disasters Volume 2, The Jet Age, he gives a brilliant account of this accident, and the chapter title is those tragic words, "I don't like this." There's a lot of other material written about this, and there are Erebus websites as well, but I feel that these are the ones that will get you to where you need to be. So I hope you find that reading really useful, and I want to thank you for staying with me on this video. It's a complex case, but thank you for watching this Great Western Air Accident special. Thank you so much for watching Great Western. Please, if you've enjoyed this video, like and consider subscribing to this channel. Your likes and subscription will encourage me and help build this brand and open up more of my insights into the world of music, television, tech and more. Thank you for watching.